why are we seeing too little action in terms of improving workplace mental health, and what policy might be useful there? So, firstly, what's the Productivity Commission and what were we doing? The Productivity Commission is a very odd Australian institution. It's essentially a government think tank in the sense that the government pays us, but we are what in Australia is called an independent statutory authority, which means that once the government has given us the terms of reference for an inquiry, we are completely independent in the way we go about that inquiry, in our reporting to the government, our recommendations to the government, and the government can't just hide the report. The government must, under the law, actually publish our reports. They may ignore them. We don't always get our recommendations accepted, but in a sense where we have a degree of independence that generally parts of government don't have. Why did we look at mental health? Well, the federal government in Australia asked us to look at mental health. It's been a significant issue in the Australian healthcare area. It's been a long neglected area or part of the Australian healthcare system. The whole inquiry process lasted about 2.5 years, and it led to what on a number of dimensions is the largest Productivity Commission report ever. For example, it had more submissions than any report over the Productivity Commission's more than 20-year life. 3 volumes plus appendices. They're all available on the web. If you just Google Productivity Commission Mental Health, you can get access to all of them. I've got volume 2 up here because chapter 7, which is in volume 2, is on mentally healthy workplaces, and I'm going to draw substantially on that chapter. A lot of the detailed analysis is in the appendices. I'm going to keep this presentation fairly high level, but if you've got questions about more of the detail, such as the econometric modelling, please ask them. I may say you'll need to look up the appendix if I can't remember off the top of my head the exact detail, but I'll do my best to answer them. So, why do we care about mental health? The simple answer is it affects many people. So, in Australia, at any point of time, about 20% of adults have met the diagnostic criteria for mental illness, around 50% at some stage in their lifetime. Here's the population split of those who at any point in time have a mental illness. You'll notice that of those who have a mental illness, most of those people are mild or moderate, although there are some people with severe mental ill health. Now, these are the numbers for Australia, but they're pretty much in line with what we see over a whole variety of countries. For example, in work done by the OECD, there is some variation between countries, but quite frankly, that variation probably has more to do with issues of stigma and unwillingness to report mental ill health more than actual inter-country variation when we're talking about mental health or mental illness. So these sort of numbers, about 20% of your population at any point of time probably meets that diagnostic criteria for a mental illness. It's probably a pretty good number to keep in your head. Now, of those people who have a mental health disorder, the vast majority are employed. So the level of employment, here again, we've got the numbers for Australia. Those without a mental health disorder, around 80% are employed, 62% for those with some level of mental health disorder. But if we go down into those numbers, the level of employment varies with the severity of psychological distress. So if we use, say, the standard Kessler-10 type measure, then roughly speaking, around 68% of people experiencing mild or moderate psychological distress are employed. This falls to 56% for those with high distress and 39% for those with very high distress, hence the average of 62% there. So really you can think about, for those with mild and moderate mental health, around about 70% will be employed, a bit less than those without a mental health issue, but still vast majority are in employment. Now, this matters for a number of reasons. Most obviously it matters because most businesses, even if they're only of moderate size, are likely to have some employees who have at least mild mental distress at any point in time. This has implications for the business, both in terms of workforce management. It may also have legal implications. Second, it matters because there is a two-way relationship between employment and mental health. So there's considerable research that shows that employment can have a positive impact on an individual's mental health. So being in employment is associated with better mental well-being and with lower rates of depression and anxiety. Being employed also provides a sense of identity and purpose, a sense of structure, and provides social connectedness, all of which are good for mental health. So employment can play a key role in recovery from mental illness, and providing a pathway to employment can be critical to an individual's recovery. But as I said, it's a two-way relationship. The relationship, there's also evidence that employment in a job that's poorly designed, such as a job with low levels of employee control, high demands or poor job security, or employment in a job in a poor work environment. For example, an environment characterised by a lack of fairness, or an environment where an individual is subject to bullying. Those sorts of jobs result in a deterioration in mental health. Further, mental ill health can impact job performance. So this leads to the third point. Having a business environment or job design that undermines workers' mental health is costly to the employers in terms of productivity. I'll return to these costs more explicitly in a second. Now again, just to show that while I'm presenting Australian data here, we're not dealing with any issue that's unique to Australia. These are the employment numbers for a range of Western OECD countries. You'll see that the gap in employment between those with no mental health disorder and those with a moderate disorder, that gap differs a bit between countries, but it's not by a huge margin. And the bottom line is the same in every country. Most people with mild or moderate mental ill health are employed. Now, if you're somebody who has worked in the area of chronic physical illness, these numbers might be surprising. They're not surprising for those of you who've worked in mental health space. But mental illness as a chronic illness is quite different to chronic physical illness because of age. Chronic physical illnesses, so I'm talking about things like diabetes, arthritis, pulmonary disorders, cancer, and so on. They tend to be diseases of age. So most people with one or more chronic physical illnesses who do not have comorbid mental ill health tend to be older people. In contrast, while many individuals with significant mental ill health also have physical comorbidities, the onset of mental illness tends to occur while young. So this is illustrated in the chart that I've got here. It covers a range of mental illnesses, but for each of them, prevalence is highest in the younger to middle-aged group. So it's very different to chronic physical illness. So the individuals in these younger to middle-aged groups, they're individuals engaged in their key education and working years. And mental illness is going to impact directly on their performance and quality of life in those years. Now, the evidence from Australia suggests that mental ill health due to the work environment is being reported more regularly. And I want to stress again, it's reported more regularly. There are issues of stigma around reporting mental ill health, and they can affect the data in this area. So this graph looks at the growth rates in workers' compensation claims. So these are claims made by an employee against an employer for injury caused in the workplace. So we can see that the growth rate in mental health claims is significantly above that for physical health claims. In fact, if you look at the growth rate of physical health claims, it's actually negative. So the absolute number of physical health claims in the workplace are actually falling in Australia. This is most likely reflecting the type of work people do and that workplaces are becoming more physically safe over time. In contrast, the number of mental health claims in the workplace in Australia is rising, and it's doing so at an increasing rate. Now, that said, the number of mental health claims is still significantly smaller than the number of physical health claims. So there are a number of factors involved here. The risk of mental health injury in most workplaces may simply be less than the risk of physical injury, but factors may mitigate against employee reporting workplace mental health injuries. So first, the one I've already mentioned, there is stigma involved. If you slip from an unsafe ladder in a workplace, you're likely to garner sympathy from your colleagues. In contrast, if you report an anxiety attack or depression in a work environment, that can often be met with a very different response. So stigma may mean that an individual is shunned rather than supported by colleagues if they report a mental health issue. It may also mean that the individual themselves feel that their mental health problems are letting the team down. But there's some self-stigma there. And this may also lead to underreporting and can lead individuals to engage in behaviour such as actually increasing working hours, trying to be a model employee, going above and beyond. And that actually creates a feedback loop that worsens their mental ill health. As part of our inquiry, we had some amazingly courageous, because they're public, submissions from individuals who had been stuck in that loop and had been able to recover from it and put in submissions to the Commission explaining this issue of self-stigma in the workplace and how that leads the employee themselves to actually undermine their own recovery. Again, if you want more details, all of those submissions, both at the draft and at the final report stage, are up on the Productivity Commission's website, and along also with the transcripts of our hearings. And if you want to really get a feel for the individual issues, some of those submissions are well worth a read. Secondly, just getting back to mental health claims versus physical health claims. Secondly, the likelihood of having a claim against an employer accepted either by the employer or by a workplace insurer is generally significantly lower for mental health claims and for physical health claims. And this can undermine the willingness of an individual to actually make such a claim in the first place. So for example, in Australia, less than 10% of physical health claims against an employer are rejected by workplace insurance schemes. In contrast, around 40%, so 4 times that number, 40% of mental health claims are rejected by workplace insurance schemes. Further, the process of proving mental health claim can be slow and litigious, particularly if the insurer wants to argue that the mental health problem was pre-existing and that the workplace was not a significant factor in the mental ill health. Finally, it's worth pointing out that some jobs have a much higher risk of mental distress than other jobs. So a survey done by Beyond Blue here in Australia found that 8% of ambulance employees, 9% of fire and rescue employees, and 11% of police employees have probable post-traumatic distress disorder. Now that's compared to, across the Australian population, approximately 4%. So certain areas of our workforce where there is exposure to trauma, particularly those employees are particularly vulnerable to workplace mental ill health. That being said, mental ill health, particularly anxiety and depression and related disorders, are reported across all industry sectors. So it's not just those first responders. All industries have issues with mental health in the workplace. If we look at the underlying cause of workplace-related mental distress, and the numbers here are claims against a workplace that have been accepted by an insurer. And we can see here that the most significant underlying factors are work pressure, harassment in the workplace, and bullying. There's slightly change between those first two groups over time. And again, this may reflect an increased willingness to report either harassment or bullying in the workplace. But you can see that both of those are the most significant causes. They're also factors that should be under the control of employers through the design of jobs and through the workplace environment. So again, it comes back to the fact that workplace mental health is something that employers can do something about. Okay, they can do something about it. Why should they bother? Why should they care? And the real reason is that workplace mental ill health is very expensive. Now, these are the high-level economic costs. I'm going to give some numbers down at the individual program level later on. But what these numbers show is, and these are the full details of how these are derived, by the way, are in the Productivity Commission's report. These represent the economic cost, so not the cost in terms of loss of quality of life, the pure economic cost in terms of lower economic output due to mental health in the workplace. The lower bound would be the number if wages fully adjusted. So if the wages that we see out in the workplace fully adjust so that somebody who, say, has absenteeism or presenteeism, but either takes more time off from work due to their mental illness or doesn't perform as well on the job, so presenteeism due to their mental illness, if that was all captured by wages, so the labour market is perfect in that sense, then we would have the lower bound of 12.2, possibly going up as high as 22.5. That's done through a wage equation, details in the report in Appendix H or J, I think, off the top of my head. Again, happy to answer questions about it. If we take the alternative assumption, which is that wages don't adjust for any of those things, then we also estimated absenteeism and presenteeism and their costs on their straight economic costs directly. And so they're the numbers of 9.6 billion and 7 billion over on the right-hand column there under upper bound. So adding those in, that would give us a number of 39.1. So anywhere between around 12 billion, I should say, to around 40 billion is the straight economic cost in Australia of workplace mental ill health. Obviously, a huge range here. Apologies. It depends on a whole bunch of things that we simply can't control for, in particular, how efficient the labour market is, so wages in the labour market. To give you a feel in terms of size, if we take that upper bound, we're talking about 2% of GDP in Australian terms. So for those of you who are overseas, obviously, it's 40 billion Australian dollars, big or small. It's a pretty sizable number in terms of our economic output. So we're talking about significant numbers here of lost productivity, which is a cost to business of mental ill health, and a cost to the individuals, of course, as well. Okay. So what can be done to make workplaces mentally healthy? First, let's consider categories of mental health risks that can arise in the workplace. So there are risk factors that directly are related to the way an individual job is designed. And I've mentioned some of those already. So for example, job demand and control. So jobs with high cognitive or emotional demands, but with little control or autonomy, are more likely to be associated with poor mental health of employees. Jobs that have an effort and reward imbalance. So if there's either the perception or experience within the job of inadequate financial or non-financial rewards, a lack of fairness as seen by the employee. Exposure to trauma is one I've already mentioned with regards to our first responders, but it's not simply trauma associated with the job. It can be trauma in the workplace, which includes managerial actions, actual or potential threats, exposure to bullying, exposure to intimidatory behaviour in the workplace. All of those count as trauma that can lead to poor mental health outcomes. And straight out job insecurity can also undermine mental health. Second group of risk factors are the workplace factors. What do I mean by this? So, for example, think of workplace support. Think of the support from colleagues and supervisors within the workplace. The more supportive that workplace environment, the more likely it is to help mitigate psychosocial risks in the workplace. And then there are the organisational level risk factors. So some of these can relate again to fairness and justice within the organisation, but they also include the level of support provided by the organisation for employees with mental distress, the physical environment of a workplace, such as, for example, if you're in a constantly noisy, stressed or overcrowded work environment, cultural factors, including management values and stigma. And I keep coming back to stigma because it's incredibly important both within the workplace and within the broader community for mental health. Finally, I've got outside risk factors there, and we cannot separate workplace factors that affect mental health from factors outside the workplace, such as significant life events, conflicting demands between home and work, and individual factors such as genetics, resilience, mental health history, lifestyle factors. Of course, it's often the interaction and ambiguity about workplace and outside factors as the underlying cause of mental distress that leads to mental health claims against a workplace being trapped in a litigious merry-go-round rather than focusing on the needs of the individual, where employers and insurers are trying to show that in fact the mental ill health is due to something else, and individual employees can get caught in a limbo where they're not receiving appropriate treatment for their mental health issues whilst a legal insurance battle is occurring on the side. And I want to come back to that because it's one of the areas where I think we can pretty easily make some policy changes that can benefit things. So I've presented a list. I've tried to strongly suggest that that mental health in the workplace is something that employers can do something about. So we've got lots of underlying issues in the workplace that may undermine mental health. So it suggests that there's a wide range of workplace interventions and programs that could make workplaces more mentally healthy. And that's absolutely true. There are many, many workplace strategies and programs that employers can adopt. For example, worker participation strategies, so including the degree to which workers feel empowered in the workplace. Employee flexibility, again, empowering workers, for example, through more flexible hours or something we've become all too used to recently, working from home. Manager and leadership training, because the interaction between managers, the leaders within the organisation and employees can be critical. There can sometimes be a fine line between reasonable management action, for example, associated with an underperforming employee, and stepping over a line where it starts to become bullying, and it is a grey area. Reasonable management action is something certainly in Australia that is sanctioned by the law. Bullying is something that is not sanctioned by the law, that receives a sanction by the law. So training in those areas can be an important approach in the workplace. Teamwork, group support, again, changing that workplace environment. Mental health education and anti-stigma programs within the workplace can be beneficial. Anti-bullying programs within the workplace. Workplace health promotion programs can be effective to help reduce mental ill health. More direct psychologically based approaches such as cognitive behavioural therapy based stress management programs for workers, often more generally in the workplace, and then workers can take them up often on a voluntary basis. It's not required that they be involved. Problem solving therapy, which is again thinking through issues that may arise either in the work environment or outside, and trying to help individuals deal with those issues. Mindfulness-based interventions, cognitive behavioural therapy-based resilience training for high-risk workers, coaching of workers, so coming down to actually that individual level within the workplace, workplace physical activity programs. There is a relationship between being physically active and mental health. The workplace can be involved there. Wellbeing checks and or screening, mental health first aid courses. So having a course, many workplaces have physical first aid courses. Having a mental health first aid course can be introduced to help make the workplace more psychologically safe. Peer support schemes. We've seen some great examples of that in Australia in the mining area and in the building area. So having individual co-workers who have received training, sometimes they have lived experience themselves of mental health issues, who you can talk to, who can help you work through the issues. And they've been very successful. Workplace counselling or employee assistance programs. So the employer actually employing an outside body who are available to help employees in distress. These are just a few of the programs and interventions that are available for employers to introduce into their workplace. And I've deliberately presented it this way because even though I haven't put it up anywhere near all of them, you should get an idea that there is a lot of them. Further, the payoffs from the right strategies, the right interventions can be really significant. So for example, KPMG and Mental Health Australia estimate the return on investment for a range of interventions, including job design, cognitive behavioural stress management therapy, and return to work programs. The latter being what I didn't mention down here. The results ranged from around $1.30 return for every dollar invested, so about a 30% return, through to over $4 in return for each dollar invested, so a 400% return. Now, other studies have also found similar returns. And there are a few off-the-shelf investments for any business that will give a 30% return. You know, if you go to a business and say, hey, I've got something that is a 30% return project, they will be pretty happy. A 400% return on a project is unbelievably good. So there are high returns from some of these interventions. And of course, the reason why these returns are so high is that for effective interventions and workplace programs that reduce mental distress, they're the flip side of those costs that I showed you earlier on. Mental distress has high workplace costs in terms of productivity. So that if you can have interventions and strategies that make a workplace mentally healthy, you can get a big payoff from them because they're reducing those costs. However, most workplaces don't do any of these. Why or why not? There are a whole range of barriers. The first one I hopefully illustrated, and I've now taken all that background noise off the slide, are hopefully illustrated by the noise itself. Put yourself in the employer's shoes. Which programs are right for your organisation? How do you find the time to compare and contrast the different alternatives? What evidence can you draw on to work out which are the best programs? If you approach an external body selling one of these programs, such as an employee assistance provider, how do you know their quality? Of course, they're going to be selling you their product, but how much can you trust what you're hearing? Is it just marketing hype? Or will it actually work in your workplace? So put simply, employers often find themselves overwhelmed with the choice and lacking both the time and the information to make those choices. And to quote from our report, it appears that while many employers are interested in investing in interventions and programs to improve mental health in the workplace, they are confused and uncertain as to the actual initiatives and or programs that would be effective and suitable for their workplaces. It's this confusion of programs, often without any evaluation, that is a significant barrier. There's a lack of evidence about what works, and there's a lack of incentives for anyone to tell you what works when they're trying to sell you their particular product. Now, that's not the only barrier, however, and I've got a couple of other ones here. First, again, stigma. Stigma associated with mental health can undermine some of these interventions and can limit employee engagement. And for at least some of the interventions, a supportive work environment is needed before the intervention can actually be implemented on the ground. So you can't start off with the intervention, you've got to actually start off by building the foundations of a supportive environment before the intervention can be used. Secondly, there can be managerial resistance. Middle and senior managers may not see the benefits of mental health programs and interventions for their area. They may see requests for such programs as a slur on their group's performance, as simply a waste of their resources, and a slur on their own management abilities. They may see the programs as a distraction and out of line with their own incentives. So, given this, how can government policy, and remember this is a Productivity Commission report, so we're advising the government, how can the government assist in creating an environment that will assist employers to create mentally healthy workplaces? The first thing is clearly to get over the information gaps. There's a couple of ways to do that. Firstly, the government can encourage organisations that provide workplace interventions, together with employers, to establish minimum standards for interventions. So, for example, the Commission recommended for Australia that providers of employee assistance programs, and there are many out there, there are a number of industry bodies, they need to work with employers, employer and employee representatives to develop minimum standards for those employee assistance programs and for the evaluation of these programs. At the moment, there is no standard that the employers are able to trust, and there needs to be one. Now, more broadly, this is one part of reducing the information barrier faced by employers. To overcome the barrier, employers need a source of reliable information about programs and interventions that have been evaluated and shown to be successful. This process can be monitored through government workplace health and safety agencies in Australia and equivalent bodies overseas. This does not mean that the agencies do the evaluations. Many of the interventions will have sponsors who have a vested interest in getting evidence to show that their intervention is effective. Evaluations need to be independent, and the relevant bodies that collate the information and make it accessible to employers need to check the veracity of the evaluations. But that's all that they do. So they make sure that there's evidence of what works, and then make sure that that's available to employers in a fashion that allows employers to work out what is useful in their workplace. Thirdly, there needs to be a legal framework that underpins mental health and mental safety in the workplace. Just as many countries have legal frameworks that underpin physical workplace safety. These frameworks need to place physical and mental workplace safety on a similar standing. Now, the details will obviously vary between countries depending on their legal structure. The legal structure should also underpin compliance. So employers will need to meet their legal duty of care around workplace psychological safety, such as identifying and eliminating or managing risks. There's numerous ways you can do that, through formal regulations, through codes of conduct. There, in Australia, we recommended codes of conduct because the evidence before us showed that many employers want to improve their workplace mental health. They recognise the benefits from this, simply that they do not have the information. So we don't think a huge stick is needed, at least in Australia. But if a stronger legal stick was needed, that's always possible. Fourthly, insurance plays a big role, and I've sort of mentioned that a few times. Employers, there's two roles that insurance can play. Firstly, through the incentives it provides for employers. Secondly, in how a claim is processed and dealt with under workplace insurance. So the first of those, employers can be motivated to improve workplace psychological safety by having incentives built in to the insurance scheme. Now, this can be done, for example, through discounts to insurance premiums for businesses that adopt evidence-based practices. And in fact, insurance companies, certainly private ones, for-profit ones, should have incentives to have innovative premiums based on evidence-based interventions. Unfortunately, at least for Australia, there are strong legal constraints that prevent them from doing that. So to the degree that there are constraints preventing insurers from encouraging safer workplaces, they should be removed. Finally, as I mentioned, when a claim is made against an employer and their insurer for a workplace mental health injury, this can initiate a long-winded litigious process based on determining whether or not the workplace was a significant cause of the injury. Now, during this process, the distressed employee can be left in a legal limbo with little access to appropriate mental health care. So the Commission recommended changing this in Australia so that all employees who make a workplace mental health claim can access paid for care for up to 6 months. Now, why 6 months? This covers almost all workers who have a mental health injury who potentially can return to work. And this helps them to return to work as rapidly as possible. It's got significant benefits in terms of the return to work, and it's actually a fairly low cost. We looked at the cost and we determined that the rise in premiums for workers' compensation insurance, at least in Australia, would be less than 1%. The Commission's estimated the potential costs and benefits of following through on these sort of recommendations. Unsurprisingly, given the figures that I put up earlier for the evaluations, for example, from KPMG, there are significant economic benefits from these sorts of interventions. So the cost of intervention is generally well and truly outweighed from the productivity benefits, even at the individual workplace level. But I do want to end up by stressing these economic costs are dwarfed by the potential benefits in terms of quality of life for the employees who are currently at risk. So I hope you enjoyed that high-level run through, and look forward to your questions. And I'll stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Oh, there we go. Now, everybody, I haven't seen any questions come through in the chat yet, so I'm going to ask for anybody who's got a question ready to go to put up your hand and put on your video, potentially, and unmute yourself. I might start the ball rolling if I may, Stephen. Oh, you're on mute, by the way, Stephen.
Oh, yeah, sorry, take myself off mute again. There we go.
So I think, touching on what you just said, I'm wondering, what's your perspective on, you've made the argument that there's incentives for employers to improve workplace mental health in terms of their own bottom line, and that those return on investment type figures tell them that. You've also talked about there being barriers to why they might not be doing that. I'm just wondering, do you think there's any argument for government intervention, government investment, or indeed health sector specifically investment in this, separate from the argument for workplaces themselves to invest in this for the improvement of health?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the Australian context, there's a range of ways governments will be involved. Obviously, they employ a whole bunch of people. The workers' compensation schemes, so these insurance schemes I've been mentioning in a number of states, are government schemes in some cases. Some cases they're private, but highly regulated. Is there room for government to do more? Certainly, some groups wanted us to recommend, I'll say more heavy-handed intervention, more regulation-based intervention, and to recommend that. the reason why we haven't at the moment is that it does, we found a lot of goodwill. And quite surprisingly from the employers, there are employer groups out there who have mental health groups among the employers trying to work out how to invest in safer, mentally healthy workplaces. Now, that's not all workplaces. Those who aren't involved in those sort of groups, often middle-sized companies where the employers simply, they're not huge corporates. They don't have big teams to support them or big HR departments, and they're simply overwhelmed. And quite frankly, they'd love to do more on mental health, but it's well down the list. So we don't see there being big direct intervention by government. Now, that being said, we do see that you need to make sure that the government sets the legal basis for mentally healthy workplaces. So again, coming back to the workplace health and safety standards, you need to make sure that mental health in the workplace, mentally healthy workplaces, is on the same level as physical health. You need to make sure that the government puts the same level of effort into policing mentally healthy workplaces as it does for physical health. And one of the reasons why we've seen physical workplace claims dropping in Australia appears to be that the government has been very effective at pushing the message about physical health, making workplaces safe. So the slipping off the ladder one, anyone in Australia who's watched television anytime in the last 12 months will know that, I didn't invent the slipping off the ladder one. There is a government ad that's on television showing the employee saying, no, I don't think it's safe to climb this ladder. Yeah, just do it or I'll find someone else to do your job. Employee goes up, falls off, and is significantly injured, and that maybe the one with the employee dies. I can't remember. Some of them are a bit graphic. Simply having government involved to say, you need the same thing in terms of mental health. And there's a bit around that coming through, but I think certainly the Australian government could do a lot more there. But I think it's that sort of intervention. It's getting down the barriers, encouraging is what's needed at the moment. Although some people have said that's not going to be enough. Kathy's got her hand up too.
We've actually got a question from Drummond first, I think, or Drummond, yeah. Are you there, or would you like me to read out your question?
Oh, hi, Stephen.
The question's, oh, there you go.
Yeah, okay, yeah, great. Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I really appreciate it. I'm just wondering what your perspective is on the role that healthcare providers play in making mentally healthy workplaces. I know it can be quite difficult for them due to their legal requirements and other aspects for them to play a role in this, but I'm just wondering on what your perspective is on the role that they can play in making mentally healthy workplaces.
Yeah, so employee assistance. So I'll grab two directions. Firstly, there's a role for clinicians. For example, some of the employee assistance programs are employed psychologists who are able to engage in face-to-face therapy for distressed employees. Some of those services are 24-hour services, and the employer pays for them. They're not cheap, but you can get a gold standard type of service and lower levels of service where you can have clinical involvement. So that's not a problem, as long as, again, the employers are aware of these services and which ones are actually valuable. The real issue is when a mental health claim is made. And because of the incentives of both the employer and the insurer, they have little incentive to have clinicians helping the employee on day one, or quite frankly, until liability gets determined. And that can mean that there's a big gap between when the mental health issues start arising and when they receive appropriate clinical treatment. Now, they can still access clinical treatment through the public health system here in Australia, but one of the issues is affordability, even under the public health system. The co-payments, for example, to see a psychiatrist, if you can find one, can be pretty high. So we saw the real failure and the real conflict, and talking to psychiatrists and psychologists involved in the workplace health and safety system, the real conflict comes in when you've got that gap in treatment, or when they're assessing the individual for workplace mental health injury, because the employees aren't silly. They know if they start talking about issues at home or past history or something, that's going to undermine their claim. The clinicians then feel like they're trying to deal with a mental health issue with one hand tied behind their back, and are unable to provide the appropriate care. And of course, all of this is leading to a report which potentially will go before a tribunal, which may act against the employee's interests. So trying to get rid of all of that conflict within the initial treatment phase was the key part of our recommendation. And the thing that really amazed us is how trivially cheap it is. When you actually look at our draft report, we said, oh, we haven't costed this. Can people give us an idea about how on earth we're going to pay for this? Then we did the costing. We said, actually, it comes to less than 1% of what they're paying on their workers' compensation claims. And again, that's not particularly surprising, because the number of mental health claims is so much less than the number of physical health claims. So, sorry, probably longer answer than you wanted, but yes, there is a role, but it's these two roles. One, helping the employers, no problem there. But two, that insurance system just has real problems with it.
Thanks, Stephen. Our next question is Kathy Halopoulos.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. That was great.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, good to see you. Look,
you're in your office.
No, I'm not. I'm at home.
Oh, okay.
I'm in my
you have a much better home office than I do.
I'm in Melbourne. So this is actually a broader issue, and one that's I've been thinking, and I don't know if it's going to come through clearly, but I just feel that sometimes we're just trying to put band-aids on things, right? And trying to yes, offer, I don't know, 6 sessions or 12 sessions. And then the bigger organisations have these employee assisted programs. And I think you've done a really great job of highlighting that, the development of mental health problems are complex. Okay, so it's usually not just one simple thing that you can fix and so be it. And so we're complicated creatures. We've got issues going on at home, at work, and so on and so forth. One thing that I do think, though, is unique to the workplace, it's what we want from our economy, okay? And there's this constant relentless pressure on growth, right? So we want our GDP to grow. A lot of us here on this call are working in universities, okay? So there's constant pressure on us to grow our research income, to grow our publications, to grow everything. And one thing that I constantly wonder about is, when is enough enough? Okay, so why are we growing so much? And it does cause a lot of pressure on people. Pressure, when people have got pressure at home, they've got all this stuff going on, and then they go to work and there's extra pressure about growth, and it starts at the top and it goes down. But it is a cultural issue that we have around growth and this continuous, I guess, focus on growth. So as an economist, I'm interested in your views on that, because I know I kind of think about this and I think, well, maybe it is a little bit too much kind of focus that we've got on growth, and maybe steady state, and we take our foot off the pedal a little bit and just kind of breathe a bit, might be good for all of us.
Yeah, so thanks for that. It's a very broad question. So
it is a broad question, but I think an important one, because it does go to culture, and it goes to workplace culture.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer it by saying growth is different to productivity. And this is something that we quite often try and point out, because you mentioned it, people confuse the two. They say, productivity, you want us to work harder and get more stuff. And sort of, no. The simple definition of productivity improvement is that you get the same stuff by doing less. So if we could go to a 4-day work week, more flexible working hours, having people working from home, keeping the same sort of output or even for a modest decrease in output, productivity actually goes up in that situation. So the confusion that, we want you to be more productive, which means we want you to work harder and under more pressure, whilst it's incredibly common in universities, and I say that as a former dean of business at Monash University, it's a completely confused economic notion, I think. So the pressures that we have in our society clearly feed into mental health issues. But as you said, mental health is complex, and the numbers, I haven't seen anyone actually do a study where they've got mental health versus different economic models or different approaches to growth and so on. But the sort of numbers that we look at in terms of mental health around the world don't tend to suggest that, it's clearly not just a Western European problem. It's clearly not just a developing country problem. It is a problem in every country. So it's not just related to pressure for growth. It means that we cannot divorce workplace mental health from more general mental health. And as I started off by saying, workplaces, well-designed workplaces are actually good for mental health. I'm not sure that many Australian university workplaces are well-designed. So, I mean, the bottom line is, if, we can take our productivity improvements in different ways. We can take them by saying, wow, we want to work longer hours and have more stuff. Or as a society, we can say, actually, we want to take it by having a better social safety net, or we want to take it by having more leisure time and more time with our kids and family and friends. That's a social choice that we need to make. I sometimes don't think that we have that discussion here in Australia, and I think we should have it. But I wouldn't use universities as my model for all workplaces, because I think universities are possibly more dysfunctional than most workplaces. I won't say anymore. I only lasted as dean for 3 years, and you can probably now see why.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yong Yi, you asked a question which I think Stephen may have already partially answered, at least in responding to Drummond's question. Do you have any bits of that question you still want to ask? Otherwise, we'll
I don't think I actually heard the answer. So, if I could have a repeat of that, that would be great.
So, do you want to ask your question then?
Okay, sure. First, I state that in 1930s, John Maynard Keynes predicted that we'd have 15-hour work weeks. I'm still yet to see that. But that aside, my question is, would it be better for workplace interventions to be delivered in-house via the employer or through independent organizations? How receptive would employees be to an in-house mental health program? I can imagine that in some workplaces, the power imbalance would deter employees from participating in employer-led programs, given the threat, perceived or real, of adverse impacts of employment. Sorry if you're repeating yourself, Stephen.
No, you've sort of answered your own question. It depends on the culture of the organisation. It depends on the relationship between the management, the leaders, and the lower level employees. In general, and this is a personal view, I can't point to any evidence behind it. In general, I think it would be better to have external groups brought in, but the key is to make sure it's a safe environment for the employees. Now, you don't necessarily need to have an outside group coming in to deliver a program to create that safe environment, but I suspect it's easier to do so. But you need to have that safe environment to get, to get the conversations, to get the program off the ground.
Thanks, Stephen. We have a hand up from Henry. If you're there, Henry.
I am. Can you hear me? Yeah, hi, Stephen. How are you? Thanks for the report, and thanks for the presentation. It was great. I just want to reflect on a point that was made at the start of the question time around legislation, and in particular the needs to encourage employers to invest more in mental health programs. You know, from what I understand, your position is that legislation, stronger legislation, which is similar to physical health, is not needed at this stage to drive mental health improvements because employers are genuinely interested in improving mental health outcomes. But how does that reconcile with, you know, the history of legislation around physical health, whereby more legislation has been required to improve physical health outcomes, even though we know that accidents from physical health also impact productivity within the workplace? You know, that motivation is there for them, yet legislation has been required to push physical health improvements. So why don't we need it for mental health?
Yeah, so I'm not saying that we don't. Okay, with regards to the workplace health and safety legislation, what we're saying is that mental health currently is it's placed at a lower level within the legislation itself, and that needs to be rectified. So we need to make sure that, for example, our model workplace health and safety legislation puts a similar emphasis on mental health in the workplace as it does with physical health. So that's part of a step. If you're saying, well, then do we need to go further in terms of the liability, in terms of potential criminal liability, for example? I would like, you know, I think we need to go in stages. You know, as a former regulator at the ACCC, I get worried when you drag out the big stick at point number one, because immediately you create a conflicting environment where an employer says, oh, I have to do this. You know, the big brother's going to beat me around the head if I don't do it. I would prefer to see a staged approach where hopefully the simple monetary incentives for mental health interventions, the reduction of the barriers, we can see how far that goes. Will that be enough? We don't know, and that's actually in our recommendation. We basically say, well, let's start here, let's move in that direction. If, as a society, we don't believe that we are getting the outcomes that are acceptable to us, then we will have to use a more regulatory, a more stronger, you know, baseball bat type approach, to use the regulatory term.
Mm-hmm.
I think Kathy's made a point there about that, suggesting that perhaps, are you talking about regulation, Kathy? There will be disincentives from stronger regulation to hire people with mental health problems.
Yeah, exactly that, Jemima. I see the attraction in it, but then I kind of think, look, the development, there are definitely some workplaces that I think, you know, are not very conducive to good mental health, no doubt about that, and employers should be held to account. But the development of mental health problems is very complicated. And if an employer feels that they're going to somehow get sued or something, you know, there could be a disincentive to hire anyone that an employer might perceive might develop a mental health problem or has a mental health problem. And we definitely don't want to go down that route. We have real problems with people with serious mental illnesses actually being in work. People with psychosis, the vast majority are not in work. You know, and we just don't want to make that worse, I think. So
no, I absolutely agree. And I don't think legislation would do that. But there are certain characteristics within workplaces that absolutely impact mental health, like asking someone to work 60 hours a week continuously. And that type of behaviour should be legislated, because we know that impacts anxiety and depression. And I don't think that organisations are going to get around to reducing those hours when they see the bottom line week on week being impacted because someone's not doing an additional project or can't can't bring in additional funding for a particular P&L target.
I mean, I think you're both actually struck the two sides of a different argument. Are we going to get our law firms, for example, to start treating their junior solicitors properly? No. They have terrible workplace cultures and they seem to thrive with those, and occasionally they get some bad press, but that's about it. Will we see increased discrimination against people with pre-existing or even the mildest of histories of mental illness if employers see it as a bigger risk to employ people who have even a mild history of mental illness? Yes, and we know that because we've already seen it. We see it in insurance. We provide some examples in our report with regards to income protection insurance. So if you apply for income protection insurance, and I think it's if you have ever, the details are in the report, but if you have ever seen a psychologist, that will almost always mean you do not get offered insurance. And it's just a bizarre form of discrimination that the insurance companies engage in. It seems to have, it would seem to be as silly as saying, well, you broke your arm when you were a kid, therefore you can't get any physical insurance or any income protection insurance now. It makes little sense, but it exists there. And our insurance companies, our workplace insurance company, our income protection insurance companies in Australia have those rules internally. And that discrimination is something that's a real factor.
Now, I'm aware we've run a little bit over time, but we've had such an interesting discussion. We have one last question that's been waiting for a little while. Is Dovey there? Dovey? Maybe not. We may have lost someone. For anybody who's joined us recently, we're actually at the end of the session, so I think that you'll be able to watch the recording as Diane's. Has our questioner gone away? I think they have. So I think that we will stop there with questions, unless we have that. No, they've gone. Okay, so thank you very much, Stephen. That was wonderful and really interesting. I've had lots to think about, and I hope so has everybody else. Let's continue the conversation, perhaps as a discipline, as a community of people in this field, and see what we can contribute. I feel like I want to know the answer to the question of what are the biggest opportunities for research to contribute in the next little while. I don't know if you have a quick answer to that one, Stephen. A lot of us would be researchers.
Yeah. The big missing element here and right across the mental health system is evaluation of interventions and programs, and working out what works. It's not the sort of work which is going to get you published in that A-star journal, but it is really important work, which academics are really well placed to do. And Kathy mentioned, the pressures to get in increased outside funds and research funds. Certainly, there's groups in health areas that fund themselves by doing evaluation type of work, but there is still far too little of it going on, and it's just an area where academics have the independence, they have the expertise to be able to help in, just inform the community debate.
That's a good point. Well, I think we'll have to draw to a close there. As mentioned earlier, the webinar will be available online on the iHear website. I think that's right, Diane. In the next few days, for anybody who wants to watch again or catch up on the bits they missed or share with colleagues. I'm just going to put back into the chat again to mention that we're the mental health special interest group of iHear, and you can join us if you're a member of iHear for free by looking at the website, and you can follow us on Twitter to see about our upcoming seminars and other. Perhaps this conversation will continue following Stephen's presentation on Twitter. We can continue the interesting debates. So thank you very much, and I think we will end there.
Good. Thanks, Jemima. Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Long, and thanks to everyone who asked questions and also just listened in. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Diane.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.